as a career choice, probably my junior year of high school. And it just kind of took off from there. So my degree is in English with a creative writing emphasis. And I ended up publishing
As
2
a
books.
career
So
choice.
I kind of made it. Sorry, I heard a weird echo.
Yeah, I had forgotten to turn on YouTube earlier, so I apologize. Hi, everyone. I'm back. I'm so sorry. I am doing this by myself today, and we had a small issue between people. I'm, filling in for someone, and I clicked the wrong button all of a sudden, and I was like, "Oh no!" I just
I'm sorry.
turned off for myself. So, could you go back for just a moment, Allison, and repeat what you had just said? I apologize because I may have interrupted some of the streaming for our audience as well.
Oh, that's okay. I was just saying, I started writing for fun, little short stories here and there when I was about 5. And the more I kept writing and the more I, dabbled around in different genres, the more I just fell in love with it. So I think probably by the time I was a junior in high school, I was seriously considering going to college, getting a degree and pursuing writing full time. And so I wouldn't say that I'm writing full time now. I have my hands pretty full with my almost 2-year-old daughter these days. But I ended up with a degree in English with a creative writing emphasis. So I kind of made it.
That's fantastic. Have you done any other jobs besides being a writer? Now that you're a full-time writer, did you previously do anything else?
Yeah, I actually got my start in food service. So my first job was at Chipotle, and I bounced around from a few different restaurants. And then while I was in college, I started working at an independent living center in deaf services. So my job was to act as an advocate for the deaf community in my area, help find assistive technology, schedule interpreters, do peer support and community outreach and things like that. And unfortunately, I had to leave that position when my husband enlisted in the military and we moved. But now I recently signed on with a new independent living center here in my area in Maryland. So I'm super excited to start that position in a couple weeks here.
Well, that's fantastic. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
I'm sure that your abilities are very much, needed in our workforce. Your ability within more than one language, especially in ASL. I know it's something that I tell our students a lot who are bilingual, that they really need to foster that skill of theirs, because it is it's a job skill in as well as other things that are really good for them as well. So that's fantastic. So let's talk about your writing for just a little bit. What was like the first book that you ever wrote?
Like the first official book?
Well, I mean, your first book that was published, I know, is in 27 days. Did you write anything before that, or was that your first book and that got published?
That was my first book that got published. I have other bits and pieces that I wrote when I first started posting on Wattpad, which is where the first edition of In 27 Days was posted. And that's where my editor found me. And eventually that's how I ended up becoming published. But I'm just going to say, please don't go looking for my Wattpad account. That's like writing from 13 years ago. So just, don't even go there. It's I don't know, it's the writing of a teenager, so don't expect that. But I know we tend to be our own worst critics, so.
Most definitely. So you don't continue to write on Wattpad?
I don't. I usually log on to do a few updates here and there, mostly about the upcoming TV series of In 27 Days that's in the works right now. But as far as posting regularly with different works in progress and things like that, no, unfortunately
I
not.
understand. I know some authors that do, and some
Mhm.
many that don't. Once they're in the publishing world, they seem to tend to stay there. But I do know a couple of authors that continue throwing things out there in Wattpad just for their audience. So let's talk about a little bit about your personal story and
Okay.
how did that affect your writing of The Silence Between Us?
Right. So that's a really good question. I grew up hard of hearing. So I started losing my hearing in my right ear when I was about 5. And it just kind of progressively got worse from there. And I eventually got my first hearing aid when I was 17. And it wasn't until I started taking ASL courses in college because I needed a foreign language for my bachelor's degree that I really just fell in love with ASL. And the teacher of that course was an interpreter for the school district. She invited us to go to our local deaf gathering, and I went, and I was just kind of amazed at how welcoming everyone was, how excited they were that some kids were coming in from the college to come and sign with them and practice their signing and things like that. And the more time I spent there and the more time I spent learning ASL, I just kind of realized, oh my gosh, I love this. This is kind of a world that I didn't even know that I maybe at least partially belonged in. And it was just amazing. It really made me feel at home. And that is eventually what led me to applying for that deaf services position that I mentioned previously. And there was about a 1 year gap between my last ASL course and when I started working in deaf services. But when I went back to the deaf gathering, they still remembered me, all the folks there. And so it was so much fun to just get involved and get to know everyone better. And that's sort of where I got the inspiration for The Silence Between Us, because I was sharing my first book in 27 days, and one of the members there said, "Hey, you should write a book for the deaf." And I thought, okay, what would that look like? And a couple months later, we got the first few chapters of The Silence Between Us, and it just kind of went from there. So it's a little bit of everything. So I would say it was um, the book here, 2/3 my experiences, 1/3 deaf services. So it's kind of a little bit of everything wrapped up in a book.
That's really interesting because having books that are own voices stories
Mhm.
is really important, and it's a really big. It's something that's talked about a lot in the publishing industry. As a librarian, as I go to conferences and different things, I hear a lot of talk about the importance of own stories, but a lot of people don't necessarily think of own voices stories outside of a racial issue. And so you're bringing an own voices story with a different issue forward, which is very nice to see because there really aren't that many books out there. I mean, I think your title is one of 2 books that I have where the protagonist is deaf. So there we really need more of those. We need more books with people with different capabilities basically is how I will phrase that. So I applaud the fact that you wrote a book like this, and it was also really interesting. One of the things that I really liked when I read your story was how you showed the language difference, the dialogue, for instance.
Mhm.
When Maya was signing, or when people were signing to her, you chose to put it all in caps, and then verbally spoken dialogue was sort of a traditional, look on the page. How did
Mhm.
you decide to do that differentiation? And why
Right.
did you decide it was necessary to differentiate the language, the dialogue that way?
Right. I for me, it was really important for the readers to not forget the fact that they were reading a conversation taking place in sign language. So I really wanted that to be the main focal point. So I took a look at some ASL textbooks that I had, and the way that ASL is portrayed in the book is typically how you'll see it in a textbook, which is written all in caps and kind of different word placement instead of um, I'm going to the store. It might be store go I or something like that. So that's why I decided to take that different route and portray it with all caps, which I've been told is a little annoying, but more often than not, people tend to have appreciated that, just to see that difference taking place. And then I also chose, like you mentioned, with spoken dialogue to have a more traditional look with apostrophes and things like that.
That was really interesting. So one of the things it made me think of, as someone who teaches English in a high school, I was looking at the difference in the language. There was a lot of descriptor words, adjectives, adverbs that were not in the ASL dialogue lines. Things like articles, that was an easy, a, and the, those are easy things to. So when you are speaking in ASL, how do you communicate descriptors, since they're not necessarily, like, I didn't see them that much in your ASL dialogue?
Right. And that might be because sometimes there are just certain English words that don't have a sign. I can't speak to exactly what those words or lack of signs might be. I am not a native ASL speaker, so I couldn't, exactly explain the difference as well as a deaf person could. But I think a lot of it also has to do with kind of the facial expressions and the emotion that you're portraying when you're signing. That portrays a lot. That might maybe make up for the lack of descriptor words, like you were saying.
I wondered if that was perhaps the case, that body language is used more, and thus would sort of replace a lot of descriptor words. Again, I didn't know, and so I thought it would be an interesting question to ask. And you make a really good point that you're not a native deaf speaker, so sometimes these are not questions that you necessarily know. So that
I wouldn't have the best answer to it. No.
I understand.
Yeah.
I understand. So talk to me about the title of your book, especially the picture on the cover. How did that title come about? Was it something that came from you, or was it something that your editor brought forward?
So the title is from me. I took a poetry class in college, and I had to write a sonnet that I titled, it was actually The Silence Between You and Me. And that is the title that I ended up using for this manuscript when it was still, in its infancy. And then eventually my editor changed it to The Silence Between Us. So nothing too fancy there. It was just the title of something I'd written in the past. But the gorgeous artwork is by a well-known deaf artist from Colorado. Her name is Nancy Rourke, and she was kind enough to create this amazing cover art for the book. So this is actually the ASL sign for friend right here. And when we were still in the planning stages, the editorial team at my publisher asked, hey, do you have any inspiration? What kind of art work do you have in mind? What are you thinking as far as the cover goes? And I included a lot of pictures that Nancy Rourke had painted. And eventually, I guess they went through a couple of different designs for the cover and then said, now we should just ask Nancy if she will create something for us. And she agreed. And we have this gorgeous cover right here that I love. So I'm very fortunate that she was willing to work with us. And this is just beautiful, in my opinion. I love it.
I do think, I agree. I think it's an absolutely gorgeous cover. And I think that there's definitely meaning in your title as well. That's something that I heard a lot when I was reading your book, when Maya talking about, just because I don't speak doesn't mean that I can't speak. I'm choosing not to speak, is, very much a message that Maya was giving as the protagonist of the story. So talk to me a little bit about that. Why do you think Maya was so adamant about that issue, but also, like, in the story, she does not want to get an implant and become part of the hearing world. Why was she that adamant?
I think that is kind of an open-ended question that might have a lot of different answers. So I'll try and kind of piece it together as best as I can. But I think a small portion of that, as far as her not wanting to voice goes, that might be one of my preferences, because personally my preferred method of communication is actually ASL. I think it's a lot more fun, um, and I prefer it. I may not be a native speaker, but I love it. So I it's a lot easier for me to focus on ASL if I'm not voicing, because ASL and English are two totally different languages. So having to speak in English but sign in ASL, when sometimes, like I mentioned before, there's no sign for a specific word or what have you. Um, that's why I prefer to do one or the other. It's really hard for me to do both. So that's kind of like a small little thing for me. Um, and you mentioned something about cochlear implants and why Maya was against getting one. Um, that's a really hot topic in the deaf community. You're going to get a different answer depending on who you ask. Some people will be really for it. Some people will say, no, absolutely not. And some people will say, it's up to that individual person, which was the point that I was trying to make in the story, is that it is an individual's decision whether or not they want to get one. And Maya's of the line of thinking that, yes, they can be great. It's just personally not for me, because it does involve, essentially a brain surgery. Like, they go in and to stimulate the auditory nerve. And for example, if you're born deaf and you've never used your hearing before, the first time that they turn your cochlear implant on, it might very well be very overwhelming. Your brain isn't used to processing noise. It's not like a perfect switch and you hear everything clearly. It's a long kind of adjustment period with lots of speech therapy, for example, involved, depending on the person. And so it's a lot to take on. It's not a choice that should be made lightly, which is, again, what Maya was trying to kind of explain. And it's a personal decision that just so happened to not be for her. She is fine and loves being part of the deaf community. And I think, at least partially, throughout the story, she kind of has a journey of self-discoveries where um, she really belongs. And I think it also might include a little bit of my own influence, feeling maybe like she has a foot in both worlds, whether that's through her connection with Bo and Nina and her friends, or, with her friend who's deaf, Melissa. Hopefully that answers your questions.
No, that does answer my question. And I totally understand that my question was a very loaded question. Like I understood that. So absolutely, you answered that very well. Another thing that I thought really interesting, especially at the beginning of the book, is as Maya was new to this hearing school,
Mhm.
a lot of the ways that the teachers treated her, she could tell by their body language that they were raising their voice. She could tell by their facial expressions, things that they were doing. And she found that she just knew that they were shouting at her, and she kept thinking, I'm not going to be able to hear you. You can raise your
Right.
voice all you want. It was interesting to me because it made me think about, I think we have 3 students this year who are deaf, and
Mhm.
we have interpreters in the building. And I have been, since I've read your novel, I have been checking myself when I'm with them to make sure that I'm not also doing that. So, so that was a really interesting point that you made in that book. So I really enjoyed that part because, of course, I'm a teacher,
Oh,
so I
I'm
was
glad.
making those connections. So but that was really interesting to think about how the world views, people with different capabilities. Um, so yeah, I just thought that was really interesting. Another thing that struck me when I was reading your book was, hold on, I've already asked. Oh, Bo Watson.
Mhm.
Bo is he's almost like a perfect boy, right? Um, and he learns signs so quickly within the story. Is that something that was just an element of your story, or are people able to pick up sign language that quickly?
Um, I think it depends a lot on the motivation that you have. And I think it's down to every individual person and their learning style, whether or not they have a teacher that they click with, and,
Mhm.
how willing they are to learn a new language. And it just so happens that, as studious and academically oriented as Bo is, he really had a drive to learn ASL and, practiced and maybe even had fun with it. So he was excited to try it out and see what happened. I know with my husband, we took ASL classes for a very short while, and he was able to pick it up pretty quickly. But we didn't get the chance to practice a lot together. So he lost most of what he learned, but he can understand what I'm signing at him, but just can't respond. So I guess it just depends on the individual.
Well, that makes sense to me what you're saying about your husband, because I have found that in my own like foreign language learning. Um, I can still hear French and read French fairly well, but boy, when we have students who speak French, I try to say something more than just hello, bonjour, and I try to say something else, and I really start tripping over myself as soon as I try to speak in that language. But I can listen and understand, and I can read and understand quite a bit. So it's probably something to do with language acquisition, which that goes beyond me. That's not the kind of teacher I
Yeah.
am. So,
Yeah.
but I can understand that. But let's talk about Bo. Is Bo based
Okay.
upon anyone that you know, or is he a character that you made up?
Kind of just made him up. Yeah, I really didn't have a direction or an idea of where I was going with the story. I actually sold this book on proposal, which means I only had a synopsis in the first 3 chapters written before I gave it to the publisher, and they said, okay, yeah, we'll buy it, we'll publish it. And then I had a few months written in my contract to write the book and then hand it back in. So it was definitely a learning experience because it took me 4 years to write my first book. And then it took me 4 months to write this one because I was on a deadline. And I had the not so brilliant idea that I was going to plan my wedding during it too. So it was quite the adventure with a lot of tears and breakdowns. And thankfully, with the support of, my husband and my family, we have a book. But the more I started playing around with the characters and started writing more of the chapters, and I kind of bounced around. I didn't necessarily write linearly. I may have like written the ending and then went back and wrote somewhere in the middle and then went back to the beginning. And the more I did that, the more the characters started to develop. And then eventually it was really easy, maybe in like the second or third draft, to kind of get a voice for Bo and Maya and how they meshed together.
It's interesting, and it's a nice segue because I have a bunch of questions about like your writing process. So your answering that one question sort of segues us naturally into that. You mentioned that it took you 4 years to write your first book, but yet
Mm-hmm.
4 months to write this one. So
Mm-hmm.
what had you learned from book one to book two as a writer that made that possible?
Mm, that is a good question. I learned how to write a synopsis for one. I am an author who does not like to work based on an outline. I kind of just like to start writing and see what happens, which is what is really the reason behind why it takes me so long to write, because I like to take my time and I can, pound out 5,000 words in one sitting, or then I might not come back to the same project for another 3 months because I just am not feeling it and I don't want to force it. So I definitely got to take my time with the first book, but because I had already, signed on the dotted line and I needed to produce a book, the pressure was on to get this book done within that time frame. So I guess you could also say I learned how to work under pressure, and also maybe not to get too necessarily attached to certain things, to just be open-minded, because what you may write in first draft may not make it to the finished product because your editor may like to chop stuff out. For example, I have 40,000 words cut out of my first book, that first manuscript that went in, because it was too long. So there's always the chance that something's going to get cut due to length, for example. So there's just a lot of different moving pieces, and no book is the same. So no writing process for each story is going to be the same. So with that being said, I would say definitely keep an open mind because you never know what's going to happen. I think I'm
Well, that's
seeing.
interesting that you say that because your two books are also very different from each other. The one
Mhm.
being the silence between us being realistic fiction, and the 27 days being not necessarily science fiction, but definitely like something
Kind of
other,
like
right? Um,
paranormal, time travel-y. Yeah.
yes,
I'm actually
exactly right.
seeing some questions pop up in the little Q&A box from
Okay,
Charlotte. Sorry we didn't get to that sooner.
that's okay. The
Um,
one says, could you describe the premise of The Silence Between Us? What is the book about? So could
sure.
you give a quick synopsis of that?
Yeah, I'll give a quick elevator pitch. It is about a girl named Maya who is deaf and moving to a new state. She has to go to a hearing school for the first time since she lost her hearing for her senior year of high school. So it's just kind of about her path to self-discovery, about which world she belongs in, whether that's the deaf or the hearing world, maybe both, and kind of the friends she makes along the way, and just kind of all the life choices that she needs to face as to what does she want to go to college for and things like that. So, in a nutshell, that is The Silence Between Us. And then, as far as my path to publication goes, um, I started publishing on Wattpad when I was a sophomore in high school. And a few years later, I got a message from who would become my editor. And she said, "Hey, I know this is super weird, but I work for this publisher. I really like your piece here. Are you interested in traditionally publishing?" And I said, "Absolutely, let's do this." And she said, "Okay, it might be a long shot. I can't promise anything, but let's get this rolling." And 3 months later, I had a contract, which is not the norm. That's quite fast tracked in the world of publishing for that quick of a turnaround, because it can take months to get that sort of thing going. Um, so once I had the contract, I was able to connect with a few other authors, and I was able to get the help I needed in finding a literary agent to help negotiate my contract and things like that, because that is totally beyond me. And I just turned 20 at the time, so I had no idea what I was doing, um, and that very quickly is my path to publication. And as far as my second book goes, it was a lot easier that time around because I already had an agent, already had a publisher that I'd worked with. So really, it was just writing those first three chapters and a synopsis and sending it off, and it was pretty quick.
You
So yeah, hopefully.
mentioned how the second book was, you wrote it on proposal. Is
Mhm.
that something that anyone out there who's wanting to consider being an author? Is that something really that only established authors are able to do versus someone who's a new
Yeah,
author?
that is my understanding. Typically, if you don't have a relationship with a publisher, they will not usually agree to buy an unfinished product from you if they don't have an idea of your work, how well it sells, how well it's marketable, things like that. So usually when you're a first time author, you're trying to sell your first book, usually it needs to be completed. Then it's a little easier the second time around to perhaps go back to the same publisher with a different kind of proposal, for example, and say, "Hey, we've worked together in the past. What do you think of this project?" And then they may be more willing to buy that proposal. It just so happens that there was some contractual thing where the publisher I had at the time, they just were like, "Hey, we want first peek at your next project." So we're like, "Okay, here you go." And it just so happens that they decided to buy it.
Well, that's fantastic for you. What was different, besides the time element and the fact
Mhm.
that your first book was your first one and your second one was a little bit different? Um, Genre wise, what was different in your process because the genres were so different? Or was there much of a difference in your process?
Gosh, um, that is a really good question. Um, I think that it just came down to like there's just two different mindsets. I think with my second book, that might be a lot more grounded in reality. A lot more of the elements of the story are not. Uh, I don't know what the right word I'm looking for, but it's not kind of like unrealistic. If that makes sense, like these, someone who's deaf or has trouble in a hearing school or has an interpreter or struggling with hearing aids and things like that. That happens. But meeting death, signing a contract, things like that, going back in time, that is a little more out there. Uh, um, so yeah, I'm not really sure how to answer that question. I mean, I'm still in that focus with that kind of writing mindset, but it's just they're two totally different things that you can't really compare.
Well, that makes sense. And you also mentioned, the difference in time as well. And I'm sure that your experience, having gone through the publication process, factored in quite a bit to make the second book different from the first. We had another question that was
Mhm.
actually fairly close to what I was planning on asking next.
Yeah.
Was how much are you expected to promote your book? Is it left up to you? Do publishers really want to see certain things? Is that put into your
Yeah.
contract even?
Um, I'm not sure as to kind of the requirements for marketing that's might be in a contract, because I'm sure it's different for every publisher and based on um I guess how well known you are and the type of book that you're trying to promote. I think it just depends. But yes, you are expected to do a lot of self promotion, and that is not something that I excel in. But I was fortunate enough to already have kind of a reader base because I'd been posting on Wattpad for a couple years. So for me, just logging on, making a post saying, "Hey, we're getting published. I'm so excited. Here are the links where you can pre-order." Like that did something for me, but I know that may not be the same case for another author. So I think it just depends based on your connections. I know quite a few authors who are librarians themselves or are teachers and already kind of have an in that sort of network as far as being able to share your work with the library association, for example. Um, but that's not something that I had. So you really just have to find what works for you.
Are you working on any novels or projects currently?
Um, I'm always trying to write. I don't know if I have anything concrete. I'd love to say yes, but to be honest, I'm not sure. Writing has been kind of hard these days with COVID and then my daughter keeping me fairly occupied. But she starts daycare next month, and I don't know, maybe I'll find some extra time to write. But at the moment, I don't have, let's say, anything in the works for publication.
I was going to ask you, you kind of brought it up a little bit yourself just that now. What has the pandemic done affecting your writing process? Or is it the combination of that? And you mentioned you have a new child as well. So, was it both of those things that has sort of kept you from doing too much right now? Or do you think the pandemic has affected your writing process?
Honestly, I think a little bit of everything has affected my writing process. My daughter being one of them, because she obviously takes up a lot of my attention. But then last year, um, I spent a couple months on my own when my husband left for training. Like I mentioned, he's in the military, so I had to pack up our house in California and drive us out to Maryland, where we live now. So that was me, my daughter, who was 9 months at the time, our German Shepherd, and two cats with a U-Haul. So I had a lot going on, and it didn't really have, that didn't leave a lot of time for writing. I was just honestly just trying to keep my head above water. And I have horrible anxiety that the pandemic did not help. So it took a long time for me to be able to like leave the house without panicking that I was going to get COVID, um, or bring something back that would harm my daughter or something like that. So I wasn't able to get out of my own head a lot, if that makes sense. And so that also didn't leave much time for writing either. I kind of was too focused on myself, I guess, to spend much time at the computer.
No, that totally makes sense, and there was no judgment in that question. I mean, the pandemic has changed all of us, in
Mhm.
many different ways. Some that are seen and some that are not seen. So I can only imagine. So that question was just a matter of, curiosity, basically.
Gotcha.
What kinds of do you have a favorite genre to read? And as you've been writing different things, do you have a favorite genre to write?
Um, I kind of like to read everything, to be honest. I love to stick to the adult, but I also like to read the classics, for example. I'm a big Jane Austen fan. Um, But honestly, um, anything that sounds interesting, um, I probably will give it a shot. I think as far as what genres I like to write, it might be easier to say I am not a fan of writing science fiction or fantasy. It's not really my thing. Everything else is kind of free game. So it really just depends on my mood. Um, but I did see we had two more questions pop up
Oh, I do
this
see we have
time
two more
from
questions.
Krista. So the
So
first,
you talked about your path to publication a little bit. Are you allowed to do self-promote your book? How do you feel about any critics of your books?
oh, to be honest, it hurts. I know you open yourself up to scrutiny when you publish, and that's just something you have to risk when you share something like that with the world. Um, but this book in particular, I I feel like a lot of my heart into this book, and I know there are definitely some critics of it out there. I've seen some not nice reviews. Um, and it hurts more so than, let's say, negative reviews of my first book, just because I pulled so much from my own experiences and put that into this novel. Um, yeah, it stings. And sometimes it makes me not want to write anymore or publish. But honestly, it's all part of the game. It's just something you're going to have to deal with. So I generally try to stay away from reviews and things like that. Um, and of course, everyone is more than welcome to write reviews and share their thoughts online. Absolutely. It's, your safe space as a reader. Share what you want. Absolutely. But my thing is just maybe don't tag the author in it, especially if you're writing a negative review. Like maybe just, I don't think the author needs to read it. That's just a personal nitpicky thing of mine. Um, and then the next question is, if you could go back in time to before you wrote this book, what, if anything, would you do right differently? Um, I think if you were to ask anyone that question, they would say there's probably a few things that they would change. And I can agree. I feel like I maybe could have handled, let's say, Maya's brother's illness a little differently. Um, and I might have, I don't know how else to say it, but maybe like beefed up Bo's character more, as far as the reasons behind some of his actions that Maya doesn't agree with. Just, little things like that. But I think that's pretty common in the writing process. It's always the coulda, shoulda, woulda thing. Um, Looks like we have more questions coming in as well, if that's okay to answer them.
Absolutely.
I honestly, do I like to write in silence or listen to music? I love Netflix as background noise. Not necessarily music all the time. I just like that background noise because when I was little, I used to play audiobooks to help me fall asleep at night. But then I would stay up hours, into the night listening to the story because I wanted to know what happened next. So I just like the sound of talking. It's kind of a weird thing. And I don't think my family or my husband ever really cared for it, for example, because one of the shows that I used to watch a lot while I was writing was The Golden Girls, and it drove my dad nuts. Um, so yeah, Netflix. And then how many years did I attend college? I went for 4 years. So my first year, I went to Fort Lewis in Durango, Colorado. And then for years 2 through 4, I moved back in with my parents to save some money and just went to the university in my town, which is CSU Pueblo in Colorado.
I also have a question from
Mhm.
someone who had emailed me a question before we even started everything today. They
Sure.
had read, I don't know, from your website or just from, publication knowledge,
Mhm.
that your first book in 27 days is being optioned for, is it a TV show or a movie?
TV series, yes.
TV series. So
Mhm.
what, could you give us an update on that information? That's what they wanted to know.
Um, Unfortunately, the pandemic has slowed that down by a great deal. It kind of moves at a glacier pace as is in non-pandemic times, but now it's going even more slowly. So I don't have an update. I the producer, his name is Dan Angel, really, really nice guy. He does his best to keep me involved and give me updates when he can. But I haven't had an update in a while, so I'm not sure what's going on. I'm not as involved as one might think in the process. I'm just kind of on the outskirts. So I don't know what's going on right now, but hopefully we'll have an update soon.
So what, you said it's a TV series. What company has optioned it?
It's a production company called Fezziwig, and they have teamed up with Sony Affirm, which is a new streaming platform. I think that Sony is or will be releasing soon, and that's about all I know. Sony.
That's interesting, and I certainly hope that all of that goes really well for you. And I can only imagine that things have, halted quite a bit,
Yep.
production wise because of the
Yep.
pandemic.
Definitely. Definitely. But hopefully, there's light at the end of the tunnel. One can hope.
Yes, absolutely. And I've heard from, just from listening to other authors at conferences and whatnot, you're not the only author I've heard say that really there's not a whole lot other than getting paid and signing on that dotted line that you give them the rights to make this. At that point, you really don't have much to say about it.
Right. I don't you actually sign away most of your rights when you publish something. So you no longer hold those certain, rights to, let's say, film. You may not hold those, so you don't really get a say in what happens. You just, like you said, sign on the dotted line, and that's that.
That's interesting because that was something I wasn't aware of. I thought that you were the author, had the film rights. So the publishing company has the film rights, or it's all dependent upon your contract.
I think it depends upon the contract.
Interesting.
I don't think every one author's situation is the same. This is just how it is for me.
That's really interesting. So do you have, since you have a degree in creative writing, and you talked about taking a lot of courses that way, what advice do you have for young writers out there or for old writers out there who haven't published yet, but are working towards that? What advice do you have for them?
I would say get outside your comfort zone because you never know what you're going to fall in love with. Like I mentioned, I had to take a poetry class. Wasn't really a fan of it, but I did okay. And I guess I kind of have a deeper appreciation for poetry now. But I also got to take like a drama class, British Lit, Shakespeare, a nonfiction, fiction, all these different writing courses that kind of forced me to step outside my comfort zone and write in a genre that I wasn't necessarily familiar with. But it's always nice to try new things because you don't know what you're capable until you try it. So definitely keep an open mind. So like I mentioned a little bit ago, I am not I don't necessarily like writing science fiction or fantasy, but I've done it before. So I can at least say that I've tried it. So I know for certain that that's not really my thing. So just get out there, try different things. Maybe it's nonfiction, maybe it's fiction, maybe it's fantasy, maybe it's romance. I don't know. You never know what you're going to fall in love with.
There was one question I have written down that I had not gotten to earlier. So getting back to the silence between us a little bit, when I was reading towards the end, when Maya kept having those issues that were like she was having difficulty finding an interpreter for college. She was, all of those things kind of like piled up. Started with her brother at the hospital and, kind of issue after issue. I wondered as a reader if you were going to change Maya's mind and she was going to get an implant. That's what I wondered, if that's what was happening in the plot. So did you at any point when you were writing, did you think Maya might have changed her mind on getting an implant, or were you gung-ho from the beginning? That was not happening with her.
No, that just is not who Maya's character became. That's not something she would back down on. She knew what she wanted, and that was to, stay deaf. And she didn't want to undergo the surgery. Again, it was her choice. But, the reality is sometimes those things do happen. You may not
Mhm.
be able to have access to an interpreter for college right away. It doesn't mean you won't get one, just means you may have to wait a while. You may not get an interpreter for a job interview, or you may, um, there's one scene where, she's trying to apply for a job. They ask her to come in for an interview. She says, great, here's, info on where you can get me an interpreter. And then they say, oh, no, sorry, that position's been filled. Uh, that happens a lot. You don't have to call it discrimination for it to be discrimination. For example,
Mhm.
I don't know, that it's kind of hard to explain, but those things do happen. So I think I just wanted to portray that in the story, but also include the fact that just because maybe those negative things are happening doesn't mean it can't get better, or that you can't still kind of work toward your goals.
You had that whole part in the story where Maya was talking. She did that presentation about the deaf college, and how that school
Gallaudet, yeah,
was, yes,
deaf
how the
president now, yeah.
trying to get a deaf president of the
Mhm.
university.
Mhm.
So I had wondered, especially when she started having some difficulty with where she wanted to go to college,
Mhm.
why didn't Maya choose to go to that school, since she had obviously known a lot about that school?
Because that would have been too far away from her family. Location would have been
That
the
makes
primary
sense.
thing. There's a good bit of distance between the Washington D.C. area, which is where Gallaudet is,
Hmm.
and then Colorado. So I think she would have researched the best college for the type of work that she wanted to do that was closest to her family, where she might still be able to live at home but still go to school.
Awesome.
Mhm.
Well, I have gone through all of my questions and I don't see any more questions that we have from the audience. So I think that it's time for us to wrap it up. So
Okay.
is there anything, well, I certainly hope audience members out there, whether you're teachers or students, that you read this book. It's one of my favorites from this year's Ellie Rosewater list, because it is so different. But it's also just a really interesting, lovely story. So I hope all of you guys give it a chance. If you have read it, please make sure that you vote. As I had mentioned, on the Rosewater website, you can vote for the book so that we can choose a Rosewater title for the year. And if you have any other questions that you want to send to me, I can certainly ship them off to Allison here, so that she can maybe, get back with you. You can certainly send them to me. So thank you, Allison, again for your time today. It's been absolutely fantastic. Garth and Emma, thank you both for all of your
Yeah.
time and your effort today. It's been
Thank
fantastic.
you.
And I've always made sure that we have closed captioning when we do these panels, but I will definitely make sure to investigate getting interpreters from now on. So I think it's very important for us to have.
Okay.
And this book has brought that to my attention, that that's something that we absolutely need. So thank you all again. And don't forget Rosie Book Award. It's ROSIE bookaward.com is where you guys can vote. Our next panel for this book festival is in 2 weeks. It's going to be on November 18th. And it is about the book They Called Us Enemy. And we are going to have the illustrator Harmony Becker with us, and one of the three authors, Justin Eisinger. That is a graphic novel. So this year we have two graphic novels we're highlighting with the festival, and we have the author and the illustrator, which will be really interesting because we've never been able to get the illustrators to participate before. So that should be a really interesting conversation. Again, that's going to be in 2 weeks, again at 1 o'clock Eastern, and that will be on November 18th, everyone. So I hope that you join us then. Thank you so very much, everyone, for your participation. It's been a fantastic day, and have a good day.
Thank you.